In a time before memory, it was a prophecy. In the Kala Chakra and the Puranas, there was said to be a land of plenty, paradise for believers, ruled over by the future Buddha Maitreya, and where the next incarnation of Vishnu, Kalki, will be born. When the world is at its most dire, from this land known as Shambhala, Maitreya or Kalki, some say they're the same, will emerge and save the world from all the evil and the Maleka, foreign barbarians who terrorize the good people of the East. Tibet and Mongolia were a land of prophecies. Rumors of the return of the Khan Kaisar, the Oirat rebel Amursana, were common among the illiterate nomads of the steppe who looked for comfort and hope during the hard-pressed times of Chinese colonization kicked off by the new administrative policies of the Qing dynasty in the late 1800s and then in the warlord period of China. The world was one of terror, beset by foreign empires and villains on all sides. And one of the great villains of the region was a man known as Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg. Seen as a manifestation of the Buddhist defender deity, Mahakala, because of his ferocity, Baron Ungern grew to have a reputation as a hero in Mongolia, but to those who knew him, he was a bloodthirsty brute. His story is one of gore and delusions of grandeur, and yet still, so much of his story is shrouded in myth. As he said, "My name is surrounded with such hate and fear that no one can judge what is true and what is false, what is history and what is myth." He was born on the 10th of January, 1886, in Graz, Austria-Hungary. Despite his location of birth, the Baron was anything but Austro-Hungarian, though he was ethnically German. On both sides of his family, he could trace his noble lineage to the high medieval period of Europe. His paternal ancestor, Johann von Sternberg, migrated from Hungary to Livonia in 1211 and married the daughter of Kaupo of Turaida. And since then, his family had been an integral part of the Baltic German nobility that lorded over peasants in the region. His family was wealthy even among other members of the nobility, owning one of the oldest textile factories in Estonia, which at its peak employed 600 workers, and historically owned the island of Hiiumaa. In addition to this, they possessed numerous manors and exploited the peasantry there. One of the traits of the Baltic German nobility was their penchant for keeping knightly manners, and in general seemed to embody the worst elements of the Germanic and Russian aristocracies at the same time. Baron Ungern himself would come to embrace this background and possess a deep loyalty for the Russian Empire and a love of his familial roots. His love ran so deep that it became an outright hatred for lower classes. He had two elder sisters, though neither survived past childhood. His younger brother, Constantine, was born in 1888 and died sometime in 1945 while in Vienna. The family traveled often around Europe and even to the Caucasus, given his father Theodore's work. However, they settled down in Tallinn in 1887. His father, having a reputation for drunkenness and cruelty, drove away his family, resulting in his wife Sophie separating and remarrying another noble in 1894. Amid this, Theodore was imprisoned for fraud and later sent to an insane asylum. His half-siblings fared better. His two maternal half-sisters survived the Second World War, though his younger half-brother Max Hermann died while fighting for the Nazis in Yugoslavia. His single paternal half-sister married a British man. But as much as the future Mad Baron's family was changing, Russia was changing much more during that time. Since the early 1800s, Russia had become the stalwart defender of conservatism and anti-revolutionary sentiment in Europe. The ideology of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality still had a great deal of purchase in the minds of the Russian elites, even in the time that the Baron grew up in. In fact, this had become even more so the case since the ascension of Alexander III in 1881. His successor, the shy and unassertive Nicholas II, was not suited to deal with the future issues of the country. In a time when the Tsar was unsuited for leadership and the elites were inflexible, Russia was going to be going through some of its most major changes yet. Factories were coming to Russia, bringing forth a new class of urban workers that Russia had never seen before. And, alongside the already discontented peasantry, it seemed that most Russians were growing to hate the political establishment, if not also the Tsar himself. With Russia under unstoppable economic and social transformation, it would only take a few shocks to the system to cause it to collapse, and Tsar Nicky was incapable of preventing it. Meanwhile, the young Baron went to school. He was a truly awful student, really awful. He often fought with other students and broke school rules, being such a terror that other bullies avoided him. In particular, he possessed a deep interest in torturing anything weaker than him, especially animals, which led to a situation where he tried to strangulate his cousin's pet owl. Oh boy. It was a relief, no doubt, when in 1901 he stopped attending classes, given that he had fallen ill with pneumonia and went south to recuperate. A little while later, he was expelled in 1902, and his stepfather wrote an application for the Naval Cadet School in St. Petersburg. Somehow, his behavior there got worse, and he was expelled in 1905. Conveniently for him, not long after the Russo-Japanese War began, when the Japanese sneak attacked the Russian Pacific Fleet, and the Baron volunteered for service, but he arrived in Manchuria too late to see combat. The Russo-Japanese War proved to be a massive failure for Russia, one which elevated Japan to great power status, and one that shook the very foundations of the Russian Empire. Unrest and uprisings spread all around Russia as the war wrapped up. Enraged by a lack of reform and the ineffective reactionary nature of the government, all over Russia, the downtrodden rose up and struck back against the powers that be. Back in Russia and Estonia, this took the form of a jackery, peasant uprising against the manorial Baltic German lords that was provoked by a massacre by the Russian army. A mix of angry peasants, rebels, and looters descended upon the Baltic German manors, plundering and burning almost 200 estates, and killing or torturing a number of Baltic German manor lords. Jurikont Manor, which Baron Ungern grew up in, was among those that was looted and burnt. You can imagine how the already aristocracy-obsessed Baron Ungern felt about the whole affair. The revolution of 1905 was stopped after the signing of the October Manifesto, which attempted to bring forth reform. It was almost instantly minimized or reversed, but the roots of Russian Tsardom had been shaken to their core. In 1906, the Baron transferred to the Pavlovsk Military School, also in the imperial capital of St. Petersburg. And there he fared much better. He even read the curriculum, and he read other books too. Occultism became a major interest in his life. At the time, this was far from a rare thing in the West or in Russia. Rasputin, Russian cosmism, the Roriches, and so on were all well-known people and concepts. In addition to occultism, Baron Ungern held a deep interest in Buddhism, which was heavily promoted in St. Petersburg by Agavan Dorjiev, who was then still in the process of building a temple in the city. The occult, Tibetan and Hindu philosophy, and occult geometrical symbols all held the Baron's interests. This was in spite of the fact that Baron Ungern rarely attended church, yet still he held a deep interest in most religions. While keeping his Lutheran faith formally, he came to see a universal truth, whether that be Buddhism, Orthodoxy, Islam, and so on, all had something worthwhile to say. He would later tie Tibetan Buddhism and biblical prophecy together, specifically Ezekiel's chariot of fire and the Tibetan Buddhist Shambhala prophecy. Judaism was exempt from this treatment, however. Beyond communists and peasants, the one thing that he hated more than anyone else were the Jews. His hatred was deep and paranoid, coming to see not only Marxism as a religion, but also believing that the Russian communists were founded in Babylon by Jews 3,000 years ago. He graduated from military school in 1908, and at his request, enrolled in the Transbaikal Cossack Army, based far out in the east around Lake Baikal, north of Mongolia. Indeed, the area was originally Mongolian lands. This is no doubt why he requested the placement. It was in the middle of nowhere and with very little to do other than gamble or drink away one's earnings. But among the host, there were many Buryats who were expert horsemen, and there Ungern endeavored to improve his already proficient riding skills. By 1910, however, he was forced to transfer to an even more remote host, the Amur Cossacks, based on an honor court's decision after Ungern had a drunken fight with a fellow soldier that resulted in a saber slash to his head. Baron Ungern was known for being a decidedly nasty drunk in the same vein as his father. His brutality and wanton cruelty were well known. In Baron Ungern's style, he insisted that he ride alone to the Amur host through the wild Siberian wilderness to prove his horsemanship. The camp at the Amur host was somehow even more dismal, though at least there the Amur host would often enter combat with a border-crossing and mounted horse bandit from China known as the Honghuzi. And by the time he arrived on the border with the decaying Qing dynasty, it was mere months away from collapsing. In 1911, on Double 10 Day, the Wuchang Uprising occurred, kickstarting uprisings all over China against the Qing dynasty. In the end, Yuan Shikai used his empowered position as the head of the Qing's Beiyang army to become the new president of China. However, Yuan Shikai came into conflict with the revolutionaries and began to use his military forces to keep control of the situation, setting the stage for the Chinese warlord period. In Mongolia, the 1911 revolution was accompanied by their own revolution. Since 1909, Mongolia, or as it was known then, Outer Mongolia, was administered by a man named Sando. Under the, quote, new administration policy promulgated by the late Qing, he forced development in Mongolia and enabled Chinese colonization of the region. By 1911, his heavy-handed policies hurt the respected Buddhist lamas in a country where 30% of the country were lamas and the majority were deeply religious, illiterate nomads, and also set the stage for the ethnic erasure of the Mongolian people in their own homeland by way of Chinese colonization. All of this resulted in the Mongol nobles coming together in secret under the guise of a religious ceremony. There they agreed to send a delegation to St. Petersburg to get assistance in getting Mongolian independence. The religious leader who oversaw the secret meeting was a Tibetan named Bogd Khan, later known as Bogd Khan. The Bogd Khan was strongly anti-Chinese, like most Tibetans and Mongolians. The Bogd Khan instructed his deeply devout Mongol population to avoid socializing with the Chinese or buy their products or clothing, even going as far to openly advocate for revolution. There will be an unimaginable amount of suffering. Black-headed Chinese become many. They do not have the love of the religion of the Buddha, and they have reached the extremes of disorder, so that it is impossible to accept the well-established law of predecessors as an example and to follow the order of heaven. Shortly after the delegation returned, Sando was ordered out of the country. His paltry 150-man force was disarmed by Russian Cossacks of the consular convoy, then led by half Buryat and half Russian native of the Transbaikal, Grigory Semyonov. Possessing great bravery and speaking Mongolian and Buryat fluently, Semyonov would later become one of the most important White Russian figures in the Russian Far East, and also one of the most important figures in the story of Baron Ungern. Eastern Mongolia was freed more or less without a shot being fired after Sando's departure, but Western and Inner Mongolia were still in Qing hands. In Western Mongolia, an army led by a trio of men, the most important being Katampatar Magsarjav, a noble who had sort of fallen into becoming a general, and Chalama, a former monk turned magical revolutionary, whose background and history is not fully known. What is known is that Chalama tried to take advantage of the prophecies to help him form his own state, claiming to be the grandchild of Amursana and then the reincarnation of him. He even dressed in Russian military uniform and used magic trickery to amaze the nomads. Both of these men became heroes to Mongolia after their liberation of Western Mongolia from the Chinese. However, the Bogd Khan feared Chalama and his strange anti-Lama ideology, and his often bloodthirsty actions, asking for the Russians for assistance to deal with him. They forced Chalama into exile until 1917. Unlike Western Mongolia, attempts to liberate Inner Mongolia proved futile. Ultimately, the people there began to seek help from the Japanese in a similar manner to the Chinese revolutionaries in 1911, but this is a later, different story. After the liberation of the western and eastern portions of Outer Mongolia, Bogd Khan was elevated to Bogd Khan as the head of the Bogd Khanate, an ultra-conservative and theocratic regime dominated by Bogd Khan and the Lamas. There has been much said about Bogd Khan. Large amounts of it is slander, but it's fair to say that he was an odd figure. He had been driven blind from disease, bloated from food and drink, and had been accused of sexual impropriety with children of both genders. What was known was his cruelty and expertise at political affairs. Using his status as the country's Buddhist authority and his scheming skills, Bogd Khan became an all-powerful despot who increasingly taxed the population to empower the religious authorities of Mongolia. In 1913, Baron Ungern resigned his military post in the Emir Host and went to Western Mongolia with the intent of joining the national movement there. Instead, he ended up joining the Russian consulate cavalry in Hovd, spent most of his time learning Mongolian and practicing his horsemanship. Just 1 year later, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, and so the First World War had begun. As soon as the Baron got wind of the war, he returned to Russia and enlisted again, being sent off to Galicia. The Eastern Front of the First World War was defined by a far greater level of mobility than on the Western Front. The opening stages of the war there were dominated by the Russian invasions of Eastern Prussia and Galicia, but only Galicia was a success. The Russian invasion of Eastern Prussia met a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Tannenberg. In these first bloody months, the Baron's unit suffered a casualty rate of 170% in the officer corps and 200% in the conscripts. The war in the East was bloody and was a massive loss of life for the Russian Empire. Baron Ungern thrived in this environment, in spite of being wounded no less than 5 times. It was there that he learned how to use cavalry and guerrilla warfare, which would help him much later on. He was awarded the Order of St. George, the Order of St. Anna, the Order of St. Stanislaus, the Order of St. Vladimir, and the Order of St. Anne. Despite having more metal on his chest than a medieval knight, the Baron moved slowly up the rungs because of his rapacious drinking and attitude problems, which were noted by his commanding officer, Pyotr Wrangel. War was his natural element. He was not an officer in the elementary sense. He knew nothing of the system, turned his nose at discipline, and was ignorant of the rudiment of decency and decorum. He was not an officer, but a hero out of Mayne Reid's novels. He was dirty and dressed untidily, slept on the floor with his Cossacks, and messed with them. When he was promoted to a civilized environment, his lack of outward refinement made him conspicuous. I tried in vain to awaken his consciousness to the need for adopting at least the external appearance of an officer. He was a man of queer contrasts. He had an angular, penetrating mind, but at the same time an astonishing lack of culture, an extremely narrow outlook, the shyness of a savage, a foolish swagger, and an unbridled temper. After a drunken incident involving a hotel room, he was transferred to the Caucasus, meeting there, likely for the first time, Grigory Semyonov. Semyonov and the Baron got along very well. Though it might not look like it, Semyonov's half-Buryat background resulted in him being looked down upon by other officers. In one of the more heartwarming moments between 2 whack jobs, Baron Ungern didn't look down upon Semyonov because of his ethnic heritage, though that isn't to say that he wasn't a prejudiced person. Jews were the target of his and Semyonov's wrath, and Semyonov's troops would later distribute the highly anti-Semitic text, The Protocols of the Elder Zion, to Japanese troops in Siberia. The pair worked together on a project to organize Assyrian men, largely victims of the lesser-known Assyrian genocide, into volunteer units to fight the Ottoman Turks. This enterprise didn't last long, however. As soon as Semyonov got the idea of organizing Buryat troops in a similar manner, the two found their way to the Transbaikal as the Russian Empire collapsed and Alexander Kerensky fumbled the situation. During the period known as dual power, given the existence of both Kerensky's provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet, both competing with the other to administer the nation, Baron Ungern and Semyonov had no loyalty to either. Regardless, the Buryat plan was accepted by both Kerensky and the Soviet, so they continued all the same, with Baron Ungern arriving in the Transbaikal on August 1st, 1917. However, they decided to recruit not just Buryats for their group, but also other Mongols, Kazakhs, and even Russians of the region for their group. With Semyonov at the helm, they organized their new forces and openly required new applicants to reject any revolutionary gains established in other military units. Once word got around about Semyonov's recruiting habits and activities, the local Bolsheviks realized that he was actually recruiting an anti-revolutionary army, but he needed money to continue his activities. In October that year, Bolsheviks stormed the White Palace, and the October Revolution had begun. 11 days later, on the 18th, they withheld any further funding for Semyonov's Buryat army project. Because of the differences between Western and Old-style Russian calendars, the October Revolution actually kicked off in November on current calendars rather than October, despite being called the October Revolution. Realizing that he had to make his move, Semyonov began his mutiny. He entered the city of Ulan-Ude and attempted to rally the citizenry and the government to the anti-Bolshevik White cause. This failed, and he was ordered arrested. He fled to the larger city of Chita, the industrial and economic heart of the growing Transbaikal, and robbed the Chita council there. After grabbing as much money as he could, he fled into Manchuria along the Trans-Manchurian Railway. Intended as a cut-through for the Trans-Siberian Railroad, the Trans-Manchurian Railway operated as a Russian concession in Chinese Manchuria. Though Russia lost its southern spur line as a result of the Russo-Japanese War, it still maintained the north line heading directly to Vladivostok. There, Semyonov disarmed the local forces in the concession zone with the support of General Horvat and built up his forces further, leaving Baron Ungern to head the forces at Manzhouli, just over the border into China. Semyonov's forces marched back into the Transbaikal, dispatching local red leadership in a variety of stomach-churning ways. In one particularly awful case, they forced captured Bolshevik leaders into the firebox of a train engine. The men tried to fight back, and so they were shot in the head and their bodies were thrown in afterwards. He went from Borgia to Olivyanya, following the path of the railway into Chita. Only a motley crew assembled by Sergei Lazo of miners, Red Guards, and converted POWs were able to hold back the advance, and they forced Semyonov back into Manchuria by March 1st, 1918. At first it appeared that the situation was untenable out east. The area was ruled by the Reds, and it didn't seem like there was anything that could stop them. And then, the Czechoslovak Legion came. They revolted, and with their armored train, kicked the Bolsheviks' butt all over. So, Red influence east of the Urals collapsed. This time, Semyonov charged again into the Transbaikal, augmented by Japanese soldiers. Semyonov would later have a close relationship with Japan, and thousands of Japanese troops would be dispatched to Siberia as part of the Siberian Intervention. In fact, this was a much larger conflict for Japan than the First World War. After hard fighting, a joint force of Semyonov and the Czechoslovakian Legion managed to defeat the Russian Reds in the Transbaikal. Semyonov set up his base in Chita, thereafter acting as something of a bandit king, taking the cream off the top of any trains, traders, and refugees who came through the region. Chita became the White Russian city of debauchery and crime. Baron Ungern never spent much, if any, time there. Instead, he was set up in the town of Daria, where he had once spent time at during his early Cossack days. There, he used a red brick building as a torture facility and kept a pet wolf in the attic, supposedly to torture prisoners with. Hundreds of refugees and migrants passed through and were terrorized by the criminality of the troops or those who came to the attention of the paranoid Mad Baron. There, Baron Ungern made his reputation, dressing as a Mongol and obsessing over fortune-telling and soothsaying, as well as displaying a deeply paranoid personality. In one particular instance, he was found hunched over a table and playing with a pack of cards. "Spades," he said. "Always spades. And the ace of hearts. You'd think there were 51 spades in the pack. You don't know?" he asked me suddenly. "What the ace of hearts means?" "No, Your Excellency." "Then you ought to." The Baron brooded for a moment or two. "The Mongols," he went on, "believe that the heart is a triangle situated in the middle of the chest, and that its apex points to the right in men and the left in women. Of course you think that's nonsense, don't you?" He stared at me in no friendly fashion. I murmured, "I'm bound to say so, Your Excellency." I didn't feel very comfortable. "You may be right," said Ungern, "or you may be wrong." He brooded again for a moment or two, and he went on, sharply, "How do you explain the fact that Mongols manage to cure diseases which we Europeans regard as incurable?" I preferred to make no reply. "I'd give a good deal to know what the Ace of Hearts means," said the Baron, as though he was talking to himself. "Do you think it's a good sign or a bad sign?" Baron Ungern gave up his drinking habit and lived a Spartan life dedicated to counter-revolution, though some believe he may have swapped alcohol for opium. He ran a tough but fair ship, with his troops affectionately calling him Grandpa, but still, he was a brutal and nasty figure to end up on the wrong side of, especially if you were a soldier who failed in your duties. His punishments could sometimes kill you. Elif Vlasievsky, the former head of the personal office of Atman Semyonov, explains it thusly. There were legends about Ungern. He was very cruel. He spared neither women nor children. On his orders, the population of entire villages were destroyed, and he himself personally took pleasure in the shooting of those doomed to death. The Baron's Spartan radicalism contrasts with Semyonov and the other whites in Transbaikal, who were little more than champagne-drinking thugs. A refusal to kill Jews in his territory and an overall more normal plan for the future of Russian governance made Semyonov slowly more and more an opponent to Baron Ungern as time went on. But for now there was no real strife between the two. The pair had more important enemies to focus on. In 1918, as he established himself in Chita, Semyonov began to draft plans for a pan-Mongol state, with assistance from the Japanese. Gathering up Buryat intellectuals at Elbek Dorji Rincho, and a dozen other of his intellectual buddies. Only 16 figures attended this great conference, and their ploy to send the representatives to the Paris Peace Conference failed. Many Mongol leaders didn't like the plan as it threatened their power. At that time, Baron Ungern also disliked the plan, seeing it as a Mongolization and modernization of Mongol culture. Semyonov's pan-Mongol state plot failed, but in the Altai, a similar project riding off the popularity of the earlier Oirat prophecy regarding Amursana tried and failed to make their own state. It represented a growing interest in the prophecies of the region. The Reds, believe it or not, also began to take advantage of these prophecies. Boris Shumyatsky handled most of the Bolshevik push on that front. Shumyatsky was a Russian Jew who had grown up in the Transbaikal and had worked on the railroad there. With a working knowledge of the Buryat language, he was made head of the eastern section of the People's Commissariat of Nationalities, headed by Stalin in 1920 to 1921. He and others pushed the concept of the Soviet Union being the liberating force of Shambhala in an attempt to exploit Mongol and Tibetan discontent there. On the 1st of September 1918, Baron Ungern formed the military unit that would act as the basis for what would formulate the future Asian Cavalry Division. But for now, Ungern was under Semyonov, and for the both of them there was a much larger opponent, and it wasn't the Bolsheviks. It was Alexander Kolchak. On November 17, 1918, former Russian Admiral Alexander Kolchak overthrew the Ufa Directory, making him the top dog in the east among the white armies. But him and Semyonov and the Transbaikal didn't agree on basic politics, with Kolchak promising resumption of the Constituent Assembly that the Bolsheviks had disbanded, which left a chance open for a Russian Republic. Semyonov and Ungern were fervent monarchists and did not agree with the concept, meaning that Semyonov and Kolchak often butted heads and infighting ensued, which lasted into 1919. Infighting and Semyonov's banditry proved to be a serious issue for the whites in Siberia. Amid all of this chaos, Baron Ungern began to develop his own plan to fight the revolution and restore the monarchies to Europe, being convinced that the already deceased Grand Duke Michael, aka Emperor Michael II, could be restored to the throne. Starting from Manchuria and Mongolia and then using the steppe people as his liberating monarchist army, everything could be reversed, apparently. In September of 1919, he went to Manchuria, where he made contact with monarchists and set up a meeting with Semyonov and Zhang Zhaolin. At that time, he married a distant relative of the Qing dynasty known as Princess Ji in an Orthodox ceremony. Princess Ji was later renamed Elena Pavlovna Ungern-Sternberg, and the pair could only communicate in English. The marriage was a political one, as Ji was a relative of General Zhang Qiwu, a mounted bandit turned cavalry commander under Zhang Zhaolin, who had control of the Chinese troops around the western part of the Trans-Manchurian Railway controlled by the whites. As the chance to toss out the Bolsheviks lessened into impossibility, he became more obsessed with Asia. I am firmly convinced that the light comes from the east, where people are not yet spoiled by the west, and where in a holy manner the foundations of goodness and honor, which were granted to us by heaven, are still preserved untouched. On January 4th, 1920, Semyonov was made the Atman of the Russian eastern outskirts by Kolchak. Not long after, the Japanese announced that they would be evacuating from Siberia alongside the rest of the Entente powers. Semyonov and the whites began to scramble, as they knew that they would be unable to maintain their positions without foreign assistance. A little over a month later, Kolchak was betrayed by the Czechoslovak Legion, who handed him over to the local SR elements, who quickly liquidated him. The whites in the Far East were collapsing. The Far Eastern Republic, a Soviet pseudo-government in the Far East, was destroying Semyonov's forces, and on August 7, 1920, Semyonov released an announcement. The commander of the Asian Cavalry Division, Lieutenant General Baron von Ungern-Sternberg, has recently disagreed with the policy of the main headquarters. Having declared his division partisan, he left in an unknown direction. From this date, his division is excluded from the army entrusted to me, and the headquarters henceforth disclaims all responsibilities for its actions. Not long after, Semyonov's forces collapsed, and Semyonov fled into exile via plane. He spent the rest of his life in Japanese service in Manchuria as the head of the region's White Russian community. Before entering Mongolia on October 1st, Baron Ungern sent a secret missive to Bogd Khan telling him he was going to liberate Mongolia. The parts mentioned in Genghis Khan's empire maybe he tried to ignore, or he simply didn't care considering that the Chinese rule in the region had gotten so awful. Because, yes, the Chinese took over Mongolia again, and it was even worse than last time. Duan Qirui and his Anhui clique had assembled an army under the auspices of fighting in the First World War, but were instead used for his own uses. When the war ended, Duan needed something to do with them, so rather than dissolve the army, he had sicked them instead on Mongolia, putting his right-hand man, Zhu Shuzheng, in charge of the force. They burst into Mongolia, putting a garrison in Ulaanbaatar and other cities throughout Outer Mongolia in short order. And so, Mongolian autonomy was ended. And given the often pompous attitude shown by the Chinese to the nations surrounding it, it was no surprise that Zhu Xingjiang quickly got Mongolians united against him. He forced Mongolian elites to kowtow to him and the flag of the Republic of China in a humiliating ceremony, and imprisoned Mongol nationalist leaders like Ulaanbaatar Magsarjav, torturing at least one nationalist figure to death. In short order, Bogd Khan and a new political party, known as the Mongolian People's Party, began to organize resistance to the Chinese forces. The MPP, the Mongolian People's Party, engaged in underground intelligence gathering, but were incapable of any major actions. Boris Chmyatsky, the head of the eastern section of the People's Commissariat of Nationalities, was instrumental in founding the Mongolian People's Party in Irkutsk in 1920, and the leader, Damdin Sukpatar, reportedly took him on as an honorary brother. During that time, there were simply too many Chinese forces there to launch an uprising, but things were changing for the better. Soon, Zhu Xingjiang would lose his position and be forced to take his forces back to China to fight the other warlords. In the aftermath, a paltry force remained in Mongolia. These remnants, no longer being paid, took to robbing the locals to get their pay. On July 25th, 1920, a letter written by the Bogd Khan was delivered by Jia Lama to the Mongolian People's Party leader Damdin Sukpatar, asking him to get the Russian Reds to liberate Mongolia. Sukpatar and other MPP leaders departed for Russia and were well received, being ordered to set up a new army for their party in Russia to prepare for the liberation of Outer Mongolia. The situation was ripe for exploitation by the time the Baron arrived a few months later on October 1st of that year, crossing over at a site known as Ust-Bukukun when heading straight for Ulaanbaatar. The exact number of his troops at this point tends to vary depending on the source, but no matter the estimate, it would always be less than what the Chinese had. Numbering over 7,000 troops, the Chinese had not just a superiority in manpower, but also in artillery and machine guns, as well as possessing a system of trenches in and around the capital of Ulaanbaatar, at that time called Urga. The Baron, not possessing either a sense of fear or self-preservation, attempted to storm the city after the Chinese refused to surrender to him. The battle, lasting from October 26th to November 4th, heavily damaged the Asian Cavalry Division and forced them to withdraw to the far eastern reaches of Mongolia upon the banks of the Karelin River. The Chinese didn't take chase, however. Instead, they engaged in looting and arrested any Russians or Mongolians suspected of separatism. There, on the banks of the Karelin River, the Baron and his troops recovered and received assistance from the local population. His army grew there, helped by the Mongol princes and groups of whites fleeing the Transbaikal. Even expertly trained Tibetan cavalry joined up after having been dispatched from the south. Among those amalgamated into Baron's forces was a man he appointed quartermaster of his forces, Vladimir Roerich, the brother of noted painter and occult leader Nicholas Roerich. The winter period was rough on the men. They didn't have much food, especially vegetables or fruit, and numerous soldiers died. The weak were killed off in many cases. Baron Ungern was obsessed with discipline and often flogged those who didn't live up to his standards, which became increasingly difficult in these desperate situations. Deserters or faithless individuals were often shot, lashed to death, or worse. This grew to be more common among the Russian soldiers, where Chahar Mongols grew to be some of the Baron's most loyal men. Those who were drunk were often punished severely, being forced to sit nude by a lake in the mid-Siberian winter, among other lurid punishments. The situation had become so internally bloody that the Baron kept a number of men whose exclusive jobs was to be an executioner. This was a stark contrast to the Chinese troops, who were lackadaisical and had close to no discipline. Taking advantage of the wide-open steppe, as the season changed, the Baron raided caravans sent from China to resupply the garrison in Ulaanbaatar. Soon, a plan was devised by the Baron and his second-in-command, Boris Brezhukin, for the capture of Ulaanbaatar. In January of 1921, a secret message from Bogd Khan gave Baron Ungern his official support to liberate Mongolia. On February 1st, they arrived outside of Ulaanbaatar, then called Ugra, and he made a special proclamation before the assault began. Upon taking Ugra, all Jews must be destroyed. Slaughtered. As the sun set, the assault began, with his forces moving in from the east. As part of the advance, a small contingent of 200 riders swept to the southeast to liberate the Bogd Khan from Manjushri Monastery south of the city. Some argue that it was instead the site where Bogd Khan had originally sought refuge after being released by his Chinese guards when the Baron's troops arrived. Either way, the securing of the Bogd Khan was a great victory for Baron Ungern. Chinese morale collapsed as a result of the early victories and continued into the next day. Baron Ungern's troops took a break on February 3rd, either to give his troops some rest or because the Lamas predicted the following day to be auspicious for finishing off the Chinese. That night they set fires along the ridges of Ulaanbaatar to give the impression of a much larger force, and rested. During this time, the Baron was described as entering the besieged city, believe it or not, as related by I.I. Serebrennikov. Those who knew Baron Ungern noted his great personal courage and fearlessness. He was not afraid, for example, to visit the besieged Urga, where the Chinese would pay dearly for his head. It happened as follows. On one bright, sunny winter day, the Baron, dressed in his usual Mongolian attire, a red cherry robe, a white hat, and a tashur in his hand, simply drove into Urga along the main road, at a medium gait. He visited the palace of the main Chinese dignitary in Urga, Chen Yi, then returned to his camp past the consular town. On the way back, passing by the prison, he noticed that the Chinese sentry here was sleeping peacefully at his post. This violation of discipline outraged the Baron. He dismounted from his horse and rewarded the sleeping sentry with several lashes. Ungern explained to the awakened and terribly frightened soldier in Chinese that the sentry on guard should not sleep and that he, Baron Ungern, punished him for this. He then mounted his horse again and calmly rode on. This appearance of Baron Ungern in Urga created a colossal sensation among the population of the city and plunged the Chinese soldiers into fear and despondency, instilling in them the confidence that some supernatural forces were behind the Baron and were helping him. The following day, his second-in-command, Rezhukin, charged into the city and took control of the Chinese merchant district known as Mai Chen, or Bai Bai City, using explosives and improvised battering rams to blow down the gates. Afterwards, the defenders drew their swords and it descended into a bloody melee that would end in a Russian victory. At that point, Baron Ungern had joined his troops in attacking the consular settlement at the Mongolian building and captured it after a counterattack. Thereafter, Baron Ungern took the building as his HQ, using the west wing of the building as his office, and the east as an interrogation center, with the basement, of course, as his prison. By the night of February 4th, the city was freed from Chinese rule, and the Chinese were hunted down by Rezhukin. Fighting with the remnants of Chinese forces continued until April 2nd, when the last of the Chinese forces were forced from the country. Baron Ungern had won the day with a lack of fear or a sense of self-preservation, as per usual, and in the aftermath the Baron kept to his promise, unleashing a bloody purge of the Russian residents of the city. His troops hunted down Jews, killing as many as 50, and also suspected Reds in a senseless bloodbath. Local Chinese and Mongolian residents weren't targeted in these massacres. He even ordered his forces to clean up the blood and bodies from the battles and massacres, also ordering the slaughtering of wild dogs that had come to feast upon the rotting corpses lying around the city. Keeping in line with the Baron's Asian favoritism, he he made sure to keep his troops in line to avoid any unnecessary incidents in the city to the local residents. Non-Russians under his command could never understand his hatred for Jews or brutality towards his own men, but they respected his bravery enough to ignore that, for now anyway. The newly re-enthroned Bogd Khan gave the Baron a high title, Dodokhan Kosoi Chinwang, in the degree of Khan, and many of his officers were also given titles of their own. In addition to all of this, Baron Ungern was declared a manifestation of Mahakala. He took to wearing Buddhist amulets on his chest, in addition to his Order of St. George medal. If it wasn't for his hair and eyes, he might just have appeared to have been a Mongol. Now, depending on the source, Baron Ungern either did or did not control the government. The Bogd Khan clearly respected him, but didn't understand the whole new Mongol Khanate to restore the monarchies thing, and he wasn't loyal. Soon after getting back in charge, he sent a letter to the Russian Reds and Chinese trying to smooth things over. The Baron later disavowed influence in the government, and the Bogd Khan claimed that he was a hostage of the Baron. But regardless, it's understood that the Baron implemented a number of progressive reforms, including implementing street cleaning, a military school, and a national bank. All of these programs far beyond the understanding of the inexperienced lamas who typically ran the theocracy. He also helped create a new currency that was backed up not by gold, but by the herds of cattle owned by the Bogd Khan. The Baron often took meetings and received reports on all aspects of the state in his headquarters, and traveled around in a requisitioned fiat. By all accounts, if the Baron was the real leader of Mongolia, he was an effective one, keeping the Chinese traders, so important for the city and country's economy, safe and willing to travel to Mongolia. Despite this, the Baron remained slovenly and dirty, and, more concerningly, incredibly violent. The Baron's progressive reforms were countered by how he chose to address law and order, using his Bureau of Political Intelligence to unleash a red witch hunt in Mongolia. He offered part of the possessions of any communist revolutionary to the informer, and, bolstered by the Baron's paranoia, made his law and order program a very bloody one indeed. Believing that Russians had been infected with a revolutionary virus, by the end of his rule an estimated 1 in 10 Russians in the city had been killed, in addition to most of their city's Jewish population. Mongols, as per usual, were unharmed. He was growing to a new plateau of power, capturing numerous artillery guns, machine guns, rifles, ammunition, and becoming a beacon for other White Russian leaders to bring them and their troops to join him. The Baron had even become renowned among the Chinese and Mongolian locals for being bulletproof, due to how wild his battlefield antics were. It is said that he had almost 10,000 men under his control at one point, though 4,000 is a much more commonly presented number. At some point, among the refugees from Siberia was a man named Ferdinand Ossendowski. Ossendowski was a member of the intelligentsia and had served in Kolchak's forces before fleeing into exile. On paper, the Baron would have hated him, but instead he became one of the Baron's few friends. In his mostly true account of his flight from Siberia, Beast Men and Gods, here is how he describes meeting the Baron for the first time. At the entrance, my eyes were struck with the sight of a pool of blood that had not yet had time to drain down into the ground, an ominous greeting that seemed to carry the very voice of one who had gone just before me. I knocked. "Come in," was the answer in a high tone. As I passed the threshold, a figure in a red silk Mongolian coat rushed at me with the spring of a tiger, grabbed and shook my hand as though in flight across my path, and then fell prone on the bed at the side of the tent. "Tell me who you are. Hereabouts there are many spies and agitators," he cried out in an hysterical voice as he fixed his eyes upon me. In one moment I perceived his appearance in psychology. A small head on wide shoulders, blonde hair in disorder, a reddish bristling mustache, a skinny, exhausted face, like those on the old Byzantine icons. Then everything faded from view, save for a big, protruding forehead overhanging steel-sharp eyes. Those eyes were fixed upon me like those of an animal from a cage. For the Baron and the ones close to him, a general sense of paranoia and also a uniquely constructed millenarianism seems to have seeped into everything they did. This mindset was described thoroughly by Dmitry Alushin in his Asian Odyssey. The whole world is rotten. Greed, hatred, and cruelty are in the saddle. We intend to organize a new empire, a new civilization. It will be called the Middle Asiatic Buddhist Empire, carved out of Mongolia, Manchuria, and eastern Siberia. Communication has already been established for that purpose with Zhang Zhaolin, the warlord of Manchuria, and with Hutuka, the living Buddha of Mongolia. Here in the historic plains we will organize an army as powerful as that of Genghis Khan. Then we will move, as that great man did, and smash the whole of Europe. The world must die, so that a new and better world may come forth, reincarnated on a higher plane. But despite all of the growth of his power, he couldn't rest. The Mongolian town of Altan Bulag had been seized by Mongolian People's Party soldiers. There they formed a new revolutionary provisional government, flying not just a red flag for communism, but also the yellow flag for Buddhism. The Baron was going to have to destroy them. Perhaps even more importantly, he'd been told numerous times by soothsayers that he had only 130 days to live. He was told that he would be reincarnated, but his interest was on the counter-revolution that he hoped to kick off with his new plan, a charge into the Transbaikal once again to provoke an uprising against the Reds. Some have suggested that the invasion north was not intended to start a great rebellion against the Soviets to help start the great empire of the Yellow people along the lines of Genghis Khan's empire, but rather as a way to restore legitimacy to his rule and rid Mongolia of its revolutionary elements. Either way, it was basically running headfirst into a brick wall, and many of his soldiers were aware of that. A number of individuals fled into exile in the lead-up to the planned invasion, including the previously mentioned Ossendowski, but not before being forced to write Baron Ungern's Order No. 15. Order No. 15 was an incredibly long, meandering document ordering the death of all the commissars, communists, Jews, and their families, in the fight against the criminal destroyers and defilers of Russia. Remember that with the complete decline of morals in Russia and complete mental and physical depravity, one cannot be guided by the old assessment. There can only be one punishment, the death penalty of various degrees. The old principles of justice have changed. There is no truth and mercy. Now there must be truth and ruthless severity. Evil, which came to destroy the divine principle in the human soul, must be uprooted. He added this for Mongols, no doubt to keep them from sympathizing with the Reds. Not many people know the essence and principles of the Red Party, but many believe in them. This is a secret Jewish party created 3,000 years ago, specifically to seize power in all countries, and its goals are now being fulfilled. All European states secretly or openly follow this party. Only Japan remains free for now. Our God, who hears our torments and sufferings of people, guides us to crush the head of this poisonous snake. This must happen in the third month of this winter. This prophecy had been given more than 2,000 years ago, so the Mongol people do not have to wait for too long. You might think that this would be Baron's great final ride, his great moment of a sort of deranged heroism. It was none of these things. Instead, it was a shambolic failure. In the lead-up to his great charge back into the Transbaikal, in May, he used his newly recruited Mongol general, the previously imprisoned Katambatar Magasarjav, to mobilize troops in western Mongolia. The Baron was attempting to assemble as large of an army as possible, conscripting as many men as he could, and engaging in mass banditry to steal cows and camels and as many taels of silver as his men could carry. Soon it was revealed that Katambatar Magasarjav had defected to the Reds, perhaps a sign of ill portents. Using camels as their beasts of burden across the Mongol steppe, Baron Ungern's forces split into two columns, one led by the Baron himself following the inland route, and the other by his trusted lieutenant, Bezukin, along the Baikal, both approaching Ulan-Ude and bypassing Altan Bulag. Both groups won some victories, but in time, the Reds and Mongols had rallied their forces. All of the forces would come to fight at Kyakhta, the Russian counterpart of Altan Bulag. The battle was punctuated by wild charges of Ungern's forces, but superior firepower and maneuvering meant that Baron Ungern was incapable of dislodging the Reds, fleeing and letting many of his men drown as they fled in a hurried retreat over the river Selenge. All the while they were harried by Soviet scout planes, and the Baron's scattered forces were chased about by the Soviets. In the midst of the confusion, Baron Ungern ordered Nikolai Kazagrandi, one of his officers who was a native of Kyakhta, to be executed on the false charge of theft. Executions and punishments continued apace despite the collapsing situation around him. In the end, the Baron was able to regain control and still held great hopes for his campaign in the Transbaikal, yet During this time on July 6th, Soviet and Mongol forces crushed Baron's forces that were left defending Ulaanbaatar, taking the capital of Mongolia without much of a fight. Heavy combat continued, sapping the Baron and Ryukin's forces of men. The Baron did win a great victory at the Buddhist monastery Tamchinsky Datsan, but by August 3rd, the white forces still with him and Ryukin had to flee back into Mongolia as larger red forces set upon them. The Baron had truly lost it at this point, reportedly riding shirtless, clattering Buddhist medallions on his bare chest in the hot Mongolian summer. All told, he was estimated at having 500 men left total, from his high of about 4,000. Using Ryukin's forces as a rearguard, they fled to Uranki Kai, modern-day Tuva, on August 15th to the 16th, and prepared to settle down for the winter there. The short window for campaigning in Siberia was coming to an end, but his forces were exhausted, with over 100 wounded, and most of them having been fleeing on horseback for days at that point. They wanted to go into exile in Manchuria. It would be a tough ride, but closer than the Baron's option, Tibet. Hunger and thirst would destroy them crossing the Gobi Desert, and all of the soldiers knew this. Yet still, the Baron rode ahead towards Tibet. A conspiracy was hatched among some of the Russian officers, and they approached Ryukin. When he refused to take part, they shot him off his horse and finished him off. Several of the conspirators rode ahead to Baron Ungern's column, and the rest quit to Manchuria. One of the riders was captured by Baron Ungern and interrogated, but he gave over no information. The other managed to get through, and the other conspirators prepared their assassination attempt upon the Baron. Once it was dark and the starving and road-weary brigade stopped, and Baron Ungern had finished meeting with his soothsayers, the assassins struck. As soon as the Baron exited his tent, a hail of bullets flew at him, but he ducked, scurrying off into the steppe shrubbery like a demonic creature. He evaded the mutineers at first, then mounted a horse and rode back to them. The scene that ensued is described as one of absolute terror. The mutineers had ordered the remaining soldiers to depart in the meantime, and the Baron wanted to stop them. Baron Ungern rode at them, atop his horse, shouting like a madman, trying to spur the soldiers against the conspirators. A conspirator shot at him, but the bullet whizzed away from him. The Baron rode off, shouting curses at his former soldiers as he headed off for his Mongol troops, who were outriders for the main column, formerly controlled by the Baron. He had expected the Mongol outriders, led by one of the last Mongol nobles in his forces, to be loyal to him and his cause. What happened next depends on who you want to believe. It's understood that he was tied up after being tricked by the Mongol noble, but how he ended up in red hands is unknown. The traditional telling is the Mongolians left him there, tied up, bowing as they left as they were afraid of his supernatural powers. A telling that some consider more likely is that they were riding with him tied up and ran into Soviet cavalrymen commanded by Red Partisan commander Pyotr Shchetskin. They did a capture by Shchetskin's partisans. The matter of the story is August 20th. Upon capture, he proudly told his captors that he was the man they were looking for, Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg. With his ampule of poison having gotten lost in the rough riding, the Baron was forced to deal with whatever the Soviets wanted to do with him. They took glee in the whole affair, sending him quickly to Novosibirsk for a show trial, the result of which having already been decided by Lenin beforehand. I advise you to pay more attention to this case, to ensure the credibility of the accusation is verified, and, if the evidence is complete, which apparently cannot be doubted, then arrange a public trial, conduct it with maximum speed, and shoot. Each step of the trip then took time to interrogate the Baron and to show him the beginnings of the new Soviet project. The Baron seemed rather odd to his Soviet captors. He was weak, almost skeletal, and whatever great fervor he had against the Soviets, they couldn't find it. In fact, he was almost like a gentle old man, but in truth, he was only 35. The Baron received a public show trial in Alexander Gardens Summer Theater, now a factory. There, he was forthright in his guilt, eagerly admitting to 2 of the 3 charges against him, only rejecting the first charge against him. 1. The participation in the armed struggle against Soviet power under the auspices of Japan. 2. The participation in the brutal massacre of civilians in the area of armed operations. 3. The participation in mass destruction of populated areas and civilians. During the trial, he spoke about his family background quite a bit, and in fact his conduct was considered so odd both before and after his capture that his lawyer attempted to argue that he was mentally ill and thus should be given solitary confinement rather than be executed. All said, the show trial took 5 hours and 20 minutes, and the full transcript was published in the regional Soviet Siberia newspaper. Without delay, he was brought into a home requisitioned by the local Cheka and was shot in the back of the head. There are some stories about his Buddhist charms reflecting one of the bullets and things like that, but there's no proof of this. The Baron was not a demon or a manifestation of a vengeful Buddhist deity. He was just a man, and perhaps that makes him all the more terrifying. Upon the news of the Mad Baron's demise reaching Bogd Khan, he ordered prayers for him in all the holy sites of Mongolia. Bogd Khan had become a puppet ruler in Mongolia once again, this time to the Soviets and Red Mongols. After he went, so did the lamas. The monasteries, the lamas, hundreds of years of Buddhist history and tradition was destroyed by the Red Guards by fire, by censorship, or by the bullet. And whatever sainthood Bogd Khan may have thought him worthy of, in Soviet and Red Mongolian culture, Baron Ungern was remembered as a villain. And even now, among audiences abroad, he's basically just a meme, a historical byword for a bloodthirsty lunatic. To the surprise of absolutely no one, after the fall of the Soviet Union, he was never rehabilitated. Though some political party in Estonia tried to build a statue of him, yeah, I don't get it either. Some people in Mongolia see him positively, and others just want to find out where his gold went. He appears to have no great fan base in Mongolia, the country that he helped free from Chinese rule so many years ago. In the aftermath of the Russian Civil War, Baron Ungern's bloodthirsty sort of hands-on brutality, cloaked in a bizarre and conspiratorial thought, drifted west. While there's no direct line between Roman von Ungern-Sternberg and Hitler, one of the most famous anti-Semitic tracts, The Protocols of the Elder Zion, was first published in German by white Russian immigrants. That same year, it became a bestseller in Germany. Tinged with the same sort of demented hate possessed by Baron Ungern, there is no doubting that the document helped provide even more of a basis for the sort of paranoid, genocidal ideology possessed later by the Nazis. The Baron is known as a madman and as a fool. His cause failed, and his liberation of Mongolia temporary. He left behind no great works nor accomplishments, merely pools of blood wherever he went, as though a spirit of a world gone mad, presaging the brutality of the regimes of the 20th century. Well, this guy was a real piece of work. I do have to say, I really enjoyed learning about the Russian Civil War in that region. I never knew all about the struggle over Siberia. I guess that's a sign that I should look into it more. Maybe I'll make a video on it someday, though my niche now appears to be guys who are a few fries short of a Happy Meal at the moment. Next video, I'm not sure right now, we'll have to see. Let me know if you have any requests. If you liked the video, please leave a like and maybe share it with somebody else who might like it. If you have any comments, feel free to leave one down below. And if you'd like to support me, you can also do so by joining my Patreon or donating to me via Ko-fi. Thank you for your consideration. Also, do check out my Twitch. Without further ado, check out this video. It's pretty good. Good stories only. Thank you.